Okay, everyone, it's Julie Middleton here from the Sussex Local Nature Partnership. These are just a few slides to really introduce you to some of the strategic thinking and principles that are being put together by various groups, both at a national level and at more of a local level, to try and guide tree planting and the use of natural carbon solutions. Okay, the key question I really want to look at is what are others doing to develop strategic thinking or approaches in order to guide tree planting and the use of natural habitats for greenhouse gas removal. And I'll just cover a bit of national level thinking and some of the local principles and strategies that are being developed. And really just to say that these are only a few that I've come across, and it's a really quick sort of look at some of the thinking that's being done. The plan will be to start collating more of these as time goes on so that they can inform our own decision making. So the first key national piece of information, a piece of work I wanted to point you to, was a very recently produced publication by the National Capital Committee entitled Advice on Using Nature-Based Interventions to Reach Net Zero Greenhouse Gas Emissions. So this is really part of their ongoing advice to national government on natural capital. So its messages are aimed mostly towards government, and there really are a push for them to sort of develop policy along with the thinking that they're advocating. It does have a useful definition of a nature-based intervention. In other words, a measure which restores or enhances natural assets and as a result will deliver multiple benefits, of which carbon storage is one. And that's quite an important concept to keep in your mind here, that the National Capital Committee's approach is very much one of looking after your assets to deliver multiple benefits. Very important principles within this, even though it is very high level and sort of nationally focused. And one of the most important is that actions to mitigate climate change must include the maintenance of our current carbon stocks as well as reduction of emissions. In other words, there's absolutely no point in us trying to suck up more carbon from the atmosphere through creation of new or restored habitats if we're not looking after the stocks of carbon that we have. And another really important thing that they flag is that we need to understand how resilient our current stocks of carbon are within habitats to climate change. Global warming, changing climate, flooding, all of these things may actually affect the ability of our habitats to hold on to the carbon that they currently have stored in them, which is important to remember. And I've put the web link there for you to access this if you want to. I'll quickly just go through what it does do. It provides a framework for thinking about natural capital and carbon that covers these different bullets here. So managing and increasing tree cover, soil carbon, improving wildlife and biodiversity, managing freshwater wetlands, and sea use changes or better management of the marine natural capital. And very quickly, just to pop through these, I'm not go through all the writing that's on the slide, it's really there for your own reference. But in terms of tree cover, really the call is for underpinning any large-scale tree planting with the best data that we have in terms of the natural capital assets that we have and where they are. Again, this real principle that runs through natural capital thinking, that if we create tree cover solely as a carbon sink and as an offset for carbon activities, then if we don't do that in a way that contributes to wider natural capital interests, we will do damage, particularly to biodiversity. The other principles within here are that we really need to plan properly for tree planting. We need to manage the tree cover that we have, and the point being that the woodlands that we have are not in great condition, and managing them properly will ensure their resilience through time. They flag the risks in particular from squirrels, deer and ash dieback. Soil and land use, again, a number of points that they flag here. But again, with soil in particular, there are huge gaps in understanding of our soil assets. And there's another call here for government to really invest in understanding better the soil assets that we have and to help develop metrics on how to measure soil health. There are some policy interventions here that are proposed, which I think are fairly low in their controversial nature, but certainly prevention of soil losses, managing soil organic carbon, and really that policy should be evidence-led but pursue low-risk interventions. there's an interesting point sort of halfway down the slide here in that any interventions that incorporate woody biomass into production systems like agriculture will offer greater mitigation, which kind of goes without saying that you're going to be storing carbon within woody biomass. So agroforestry springs to mind here. And the other big carbon intervention is obviously to prevent loss of carbon from degraded peatland. So the proposal here is that peat soil should be taken out of all but lowest impact agriculture, restore 50% of upland peat, 25% of lowland peat, and look at reducing the intensity of agriculture on other soils. Quickly on improving wildlife and biodiversity. Again, this is about making sure that the better the condition of our natural capital assets, the more species and genetically rich they will be, and therefore the more resilient they will be into the future. So, and a plea at the bottom of the slide there to think through whole system impacts before we put big, large-scale climate mitigation proposals such as biofuels, growing biofuels, into action. In other words, what can this sort of intervention do to overall land use and this carbon storage and habitats? Freshwater and wetlands. There's yet again not quite enough understanding around the carbon flux in wetlands. In other words, the movement of carbon between soils and sediments, the wetlands themselves and the atmosphere. And climate change itself will affect this, and impacts of land use will affect this. Increasing the organic matter in wetlands by planting trees nearby can do this too. So much of the thinking around this is that we need more information, and just to take some of these impacts into consideration. And then sea and coastal, again, very much this section flags the huge potential in our coastal habitats for carbon storage, the limitations on our ability to do much with this because of coastal squeeze, the fact that if we are going to use these habitats for carbon storage, we need to consider quite significant interventions to protect and restore these habitats. Worth flagging as well in the middle there that protection and restoration, the one above, reduced seabed disturbance will lead to an increase in climate regulation. This is a huge area of carbon storage that we really just have no clue about right now, but it would have implications for example, thinking about marine development in much more in a climate context. So that's the Natural Capital Committee. The next one I wanted just to flag is a very high level set of principles developed by Wildlife and Countryside Link around tree planting, and you can have a look at these themselves. And these are very similar to many of the principles being developed by NGOs at a high level, and they are around things like favouring native trees and woodland, requiring spatial strategy to guide woodland expansion, and you can have a look at those. But again, they're pretty high level, but it would be very useful for LNP members to think about communicating some of these sorts of broad principles to MPs or other decision makers that are influencing national policy. Another interesting one is the approach being sort of recommended by Friends of the Earth within the context of their campaign to double tree cover, and particularly targeting local authorities and challenging them to double their tree cover. So they have developed a sort of set of trade-offs and principles that need to be taken into consideration, which are quite useful, and you start seeing some of the common principles coming out again. So the point here being that land for trees needs to come from agricultural land, that's their view. But in order to minimise the impact on food supply, they would be targeting low-grade rough pasture. Again, the second bullet, they're looking for greatest public benefit. So look for those multiple benefits that can be leveraged through putting woodland of the right type in the right place. Interestingly, though, they're calling for greening the green belt, actually using the green belt and accessible woodland on the outskirts of towns and cities, but do acknowledge that there's a trade-off there with land that could be ideal for housing. So they're looking at these sorts of areas where you've got poor quality agricultural land. They do accept and acknowledge that more woodland and remote places upland, particularly in upper catchments where there's can both have biodiversity and flood risk prevention benefits. The total no-brainer is avoiding deep peat bogs. That's really clear in everything you read at the moment about tree planting, but obviously not as relevant for Sussex. But I think the key is that any soil that can produce peat is one of the soil types that stores the greatest carbon, where tree planting will release that carbon, therefore isn't an appropriate intervention. Another obvious principle that I think makes complete sense, particularly in a more local context here, is to avoid species-rich grasslands and other priority habitats. The big caveat here is that we don't really have the spatial data to direct this at a high level, that the grassland inventory is incomplete. But I think this is something that can be overcome by doing much better surveying of sites, and I will come on to that shortly. They don't really provide species guidance, Friends of the Earth, but do note historical large-scale mistakes around Sitka spruce plantations, for example, that may have been made in the Highlands of Scotland in the 70s. And they have a general call for improved forestry standards. So focusing more literally, really, the local example that I've come across here is the Surrey Nature Partnership, which has come up with a position statement on tree planting. The interesting thing here is what they do is they set it out from the premise, or the original starting point, that Surrey is already a wooded county, and you have to take that into consideration. So the role of additional woodland creation should be seen in that context. Where is the woodland already, and how can it be used to help connect and strengthen woodland ecosystem networks? The tree planting and woodland creation also needs to work within the wider context of protection and recovery of other threatened open habitats. So that it shouldn't compromise other more significant or beneficial habitat restoration or creation. So you need to trade off and weigh up tree planting versus restoration and improvement of the existing habitats for biodiversity reasons. They really raise the issue that in northern temperate climates, tree planting really shouldn't be the frontline solution to mitigating climate change. It is in the tropics predominantly because trees grow so fast and store so much carbon, but it can't be the only solution here. And they are cautious around the fact that initial planting may release carbon through soil disturbance, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Like others, planting and aftercare has a carbon footprint. You need to not only make sure your trees are managed and kept on the ground, but you should take into consideration that there are vehicles and carbon emissions involved in managing your woodland, and the use of the woodland in any kind of sense of fuel will also release carbon, so that needs to be taken into consideration in your carbon balance. The right tree in the right place for the right reason is another principle. Again, one that's echoed in the Natural Capital Committee work that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The Surrey Nature Partnership position statement concludes with a decision-making tool, which really makes the point that tree planting should be guided on a site-by-site basis by an understanding and knowledge of the characteristics of the site. So this, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can run through this yourselves, and it does start by sort of thinking through whether or not the original site has been surveyed. If it hasn't been surveyed, then it should be surveyed. If the survey concludes that it's suitable for other habitat restoration, for example, species at grassland and heathland in the Surrey context, well then basically go ahead and take that as your direction for the site. If not, then perhaps it would be feasible to go ahead with the tree planting, and that the woodland creation scheme must then be decided by site conditions, public health and safety risks, woodland or woodland pasture targets, the choice of trees, for example. So that's a very quick run through some of the strategies and strategic thinking and principles that are evolving around tree planting and the use of natural capital solutions for carbon. It's very early days in the strategic thinking across the country, but this is an area where the Nature Partnership here in Sussex can continue to collate and share information about what others are doing, and work its own way towards as well the production of some sort of strategic guideline for tree planting or natural capital investment for carbon, if that's what members would find helpful. Many thanks.